Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. This section is going to be Section 10. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to cover tariffs and subsidies in a large economy. And so last week, we turned our attention to the ways that governments seek to influence trade. And I know it says through use of tariff trade policies such as tariffs, quotas, and subsidies, but we really only focused on tariffs. And so this week, what we're going to think about is we're going to think about other trade policies. In particular, we're going to consider subsidies. And so we're in thinking about both tariffs and export subsidies. They're going to have similar, but not entirely equal effects. In particular, we're going to see that they're going to have different implications for terms of trade. That is going to be how much each policy might affect the world price. And also, and correspondingly, how much it might affect welfare for a given country that applies it. And so in particular, what we're going to think is we're going to think that we're going to think about basically everything in this section is going to be done from the perspective of home being a large economy. So what that's going to mean is it's going to be that, like last time, if home is a large economy, then its actions can influence prices because it's large enough to have an impact on overall demand for goods. And so what you can think is that, regardless of whether or not it's the policy applied as a tariff or it's going to be an export subsidy, if home is a large country, then either of those two policies are going to lead to a reduction in import demand from home, because they're going to both stimulate production of domestic producers. And so that reduction in import demand is going to yield that the world price must fall because a reduction in demand is going to yield a decrease in prices. What I'm going to refer to that as is that sort of reduction in world prices stimulated by a decrease in import demand is going to be a terms of trade effect. And then, as we're going to see, those terms of trade effects can vary for different policies, but they're going to mean that reduction in prices caused by a trade policy can mean that these both policies of tariffs and subsidies can have potentially welfare increasing effects, although their welfare increasing effects are going to vary depending on their implementation. So we'll see that with exercises here in a bit. So the first question is basically a setup that's very similar to what we've seen already in Section 9. We're going to consider basically home to be a large country, and there's going to be two countries, home and foreign. We're going to think about there being one good, say a USB adapter. All of the quantities demanded and supplied, you can think that really these are all in millions to sort of match the fact that probably most countries demand millions of USB adapters and supply millions. Doesn't really matter. I'm just going to leave them in units. I'm not going to really think of them as millions, but you can think of it as. And we're going to think that both home and foreign are going to be producing some amount of USB adapters. Okay, and so what we're going to think of is first we're going to set up these supply and demand equations given below for both foreign and home production of USB adapters and foreign and home's demand for USB adapters. And then basically what this question is going to ask is it's going to ask us to calculate the sort of equilibrium condition in terms of price and then the amount of imports and sort of correspondingly exports of USB adapters. Okay, so right now we're not going to think of any trade policies being applied. We're just going to think of a free trade equilibrium. And so first, let's start off with trying to think about foreign's export supply curve. And so foreign's export supply curve can basically be derived as the amount foreign supplies minus the amount it demands as long as this quantity is positive. And so I'll show you that having that quantity be positive, let me come back to that. So let's basically, for right now, let's assume that this quantity is going to be positive, and then I'll come back to verifying that this in fact will be the case. But if this wasn't positive, then we'd actually have the foreign is actually foreign actually demands the good, and that would be the case if the quantity demanded by foreign is going to be greater than the quantity that it supplies. This won't be the case here, but just note that this will only be true if foreign will only be a net exporter if it supplies more than or produces more than it demands. Okay, so to figure out foreign's export supply, we're just going to go back to foreign's supply and demand equations. So foreign export supply is going to be equal to its supply minus its demand. So we should get 15 minus 5p. So what we should get is we should get that foreign's export supply is -5 plus 10p. Okay, and so so that what I've written down matches with the one addition that we want to make sure that this p is representing the world price. Okay, so that's how we figure out foreign's export supply. Now let's figure out home's import demand. Again, home's import demand, this will be import demand as long as home demands more than it supplies. We'll see that that's the case, but I'll come back to how you verify that. And then as it turns out, if you just plug in home's demand and then supply equations from before, you'll get that home's import demand is 15 minus 10 PW. Okay. So now, how do we figure out what the equilibrium price is going to be when these two countries open up to free trade? Well, there's two ways to do it. The first way is to use that total demand for a commodity must equal the total supply. So what is that saying? So that's saying, if I take home's demand plus sorry, excuse me, that should say foreign's demand. That should be equal to home supply plus foreign supply. So in other words, total demand should be equal to total supply. Okay, so that's one equation. So I just want to clarify this is the same equilibrium condition as what we've seen before. But we can also subtract, for instance, we can subtract foreign demand from both sides, and we can subtract home supply from both sides. And what is that going to give us? It's going to give us the equivalent condition that we could either use excuse me. We can either use that total demand is equal to total supply, or we can note that this left-hand side is equal to, home's import demand, and this right-hand side here is equal to foreign's export supply. So this is just one way of showing that these equilibrium conditions are equal. Okay, and so let's use that home's export demand is equal to foreign's export supply because we've already derived those equations. So we're just copying these values that we've calculated for their export supply and import demand curves from before, and then once we've equated them, I can add 5 to both sides. For instance, I can add 10p to both sides. And so what is this going to give me? It's going to give me that 20 is equal to 20p world. And so if I divide by 20 on both sides, what do I get? I get that p world is going to be equal to 1. So when these countries start freely trading, the world price is going to be 1. So then if I want to figure out the quantity traded, well, I can just go back into either of the import demand curves or the foreign export supply curves, plug in this price of 1, Let's do this with homes import demand. Obviously, it's going to give you the same result if you plug it into foreign export supply because the two are equal. So this will give you that homes import demand is going to be 5. So if homes imports are 5, of course, it must also be that the amount that foreign is going to be supplying, there are only 2 countries here, is also 5. So the quantity traded, that's just 5. And that's what the slides are saying right there.